Bugünkü son oturumun konuşmacısı Bayan Pauline Lee. Kendisinin kısaca özgeçmişi hakkında bilgi vermek istiyorum. Pauline Lee, öyküsel perspektif açısından, özellikle öyküsel anlatım perspektif açısından 10 yılı aşkın bir zamandır çalışmalar yapmakta olan Avustralyalı bir sosyal hizmet uzmanı kendileri. Yürütmekte olduğu çalışmalar nedeniyle değişik ülkelerde bulunmuş. Moğolistan, Benin, Christmas Adası, Malezya, Filistin, Türkiye ve Ukrayna'da çalışmalar yürütmüş bir meslektaşımız. Pauline, travma yaşayan kadınların ve çocukların vermiş oldukları tepkiler içinde yer alan öyküsel anlatımları aile içi şiddet bağlamında inceleyen çalışmalar gerçekleştirmekte. Bu çalışmalarını takiben de savaş ve benzeri nedenlerle göç etmek zorunda kalan, özellikle Avustralya'ya ve Christmas Adası'na göç etmek zorunda kalan, şiddet ve ayrımcılığa uğrayan insanlarla çalışmalarını yürütmekte. Özellikle bu göçmenlerin yaşamış oldukları travmaları, hatta süregelen travmaları inceleyen, onlarla çalışmalar yürüten bir bilim insanı. Pauline şu anda Fransa'da yaşamakta olup süpervizyon, psikolojik danışma ve aralarında Türkiye'nin de bulunduğu değişik ülkelerde öyküsel terapi eğitimlerine devam etmekte kendileri. Şimdi kendileri travmaya öyküsel anlatım açısından tepkiler, Avustralya'da barınma arayışı içinde olan insanlarla konuşmalar başlıklı bir sunum yapacak. Evet, ben sözü kendilerine bırakıyorum. Yes, the word is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today. And I'd like to invite you to share with me some of the work that I've been involved in with asylum seekers in Australia. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that instead of me sitting here speaking with you today, it should be the people whose stories I'll be sharing, who've generously given their permission for their stories to be heard today. I have the privilege to hold a passport, and I can cross borders with ease. I dedicate this presentation to those who are seeking asylum and wish that they may have the opportunity for safety and belonging. When I met with Abdullah for the first time, a 16-year-old young man from Afghanistan, he thanked me with a very solemn politeness for making the time to meet with him. But he was not sure that he wanted to speak to me. Of course, that's okay, I replied. But was he able to share with me his main concern about speaking, just in case there was something that we might be able to do together? Abdullah replied simply that anyone that he becomes close to disappears. I inquired further about the effects of people disappearing from Abdullah's life, and he shared that the most challenging aspect was the not knowing, the not saying goodbye. I thought about this and asked Abdullah if it would be okay if I could share with him some of the things that I did know and some of the things I didn't know about counselling on Christmas Island. Abdullah wasn't really sure that that was going to be helpful, but he gave me the benefit of the doubt. I spoke about uncertainty and unpredictability, and I said that there were some ideas I'd been trying out in response to this. I spoke about this idea of attending to goodbyes at the beginning, every time. At that point, Abdullah interrupted me. So you mean that we could pretend that this is the only time we ever meet, and I could talk about anything that I wanted to, and we wouldn't have to say goodbye or be sad because we wouldn't see each other again? I asked him if we did try this, would it work for him? Would it be helpful? And yes, was the enthusiastic response. And off we went, guided by what was important for Abdullah in those moments. I hope for Abdullah that he experienced an alternative ending to the dominant story of people disappearing, one where he had a sense of control or choice he'd been able to prepare and plan for. Guided by Abdullah, we continue to work for another 3 months together. But he comes into the room today to be with us, to consider the importance of the micro practices, the ways that we form relationships. It might not look like a large therapeutic practice, but let's consider what the effect is on Abdullah's life, on the losses that he has already experienced, and on the ways that he can make sense and move forward. Michael White, one of the founders of narrative therapy, says to us that no one is a passive recipient of trauma. People always take steps to try to prevent the trauma, and if preventing the trauma is not possible, they take steps to try to modify it in some small way, or to modify its effects on their lives, or they take steps in efforts to preserve what is precious to them. Even in the face of overwhelming trauma, people take steps to try to protect and to preserve what they give value to. What Michael White's talking about here is crucial and essential in our narrative responses to trauma, because as we're listening to a story of suffering, of hardship, we are listening to the details, but we are also listening to the way that people are trying to respond. The more that we can bring those stories alive, to enrich them, to fully describe them, contributes to people reconnecting with a sense of identity. I'm only supposed to talk for a short time today, and I can see myself getting very involved, so I need to keep moving. Okay, to give you some context. In 2001, I moved with my family to live and work on Christmas Island. Christmas Island is situated 300 kilometres south of Jakarta. It takes about 3 hours to fly from Perth in Western Australia. It's, what did I want to say? It's got a settled population of about 2,000 people, 70% of which are Malay Chinese heritage, and it is considered a part of Western Australia, but it is federally managed, so it's managed by federal Australia. And Christmas Island was historically known for phosphate, for the production of phosphate. And there is no peoples that are indigenous to the island, but there are 40 million red land crabs that call Christmas Island home. It's, I guess it's become better known, or infamously known, as the centre of Australia's border protection policies and immigration policies. So Christmas Island has a detention centre that was built in 2001, which has expanded in capacity over the years. So let's consider the boat trip that people take to reach Christmas Island. At the moment, you can leave from 2 possible locations, one being Indonesia, which takes a minimum of 3 days in a boat that is like an old fishing boat. It doesn't have life jackets. About 40 to 120 people on one boat. And during the 3 years that I was there, there were many tragedies where boats didn't make it, or if they made it and weren't intercepted by the Navy, then they often would crash on Christmas Island's extremely rocky and dangerous coastline. If people come from Sri Lanka, it's 22 days minimum. And we're talking about children, young people, families, people with sickness, disability, without food and limited water. I guess what I want to say in regards to the boat trip is that in itself is an extremely traumatic experience. Our colleagues in Palestine talk about in our therapeutic work, responding to trauma, how we also notice times when people make a stand for the human rights of others. There might be examples in their family. It might be a small remark or a statement. But if people are indicating a respect for the human rights of others, then we try to notice it and acknowledge it. These are openings to different stories of identity, stories of value and stories of agency. They're also ways of linking their small contributions to the contributions of others. And if we think about it in the context of trauma, especially what we've heard from all our speakers today, is trauma seeks to disconnect us from our relationships, disconnect us from our body, disconnect us from our identity. So sometimes we can't speak first for the horror that we've experienced. But what we can do is ask people, what did they do? What steps did they take to take care or to reduce the effects for a family member? I had a family in my room, and to have a family in the room, there was about 7 people. And there was 3 young children, and we were trying to be quite inclusive. They had just come from Indonesia, but their boat had capsized, and they'd been in the water for over 6 hours. If you can imagine that sense of looking without seeing, that was the way I was experiencing them in the room, and there was a disconnect from one another. And I remember asking that question in that boat trip coming across, as you were in the water, because this could go a really wrong way. This could go to re-traumatization, yeah? We're in risky waters. But the question took us another way. As you were in the water, what were you doing to take care, to look after, to reduce the effects for your family members? And you know who answered me? The 4-year-old. And the 4-year-old said, "My dad is so strong. My dad had his arm linked under me and was holding one piece of floating wood." So he said, in that moment, my dad could have let go of me because he was very tired, but he didn't. Take a moment to think, in that sharing, what does that do for the family? It moves from this sense of being overwhelmed and passive in the face of trauma to recognising that we have ability, that we can experience ourselves as able and contributing in those moments. I'm getting carried away again, sorry. So I was employed as a torture and trauma counsellor, and we were co-located at the community hospital. And when I say hospital, that's a bit of a stretch of the imagination. It's really an 8-bed shed. Does shed translate? Maybe, I don't know. And we were the only service that was located out of the detention centre. So people were transported from the detention centre to our service. The minimum stay when I first arrived there, the minimum stay for people were 8 months in detention. And for some people, in that 8 months, the only time that they got out of that detention centre was to come for their counselling session. When I arrived in 2011, people were still able to have their application for refugee status considered, and the minimum stay on Christmas Island, like I said, was around 8 months, but it went up to around 2 years. By the time I left in 2014, no one had the right to have their refugee status processed. and they were facing 4 distressing pathways. One was to be transferred to an island called Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, or an island called Nauru in the Pacific, which was considered to be an offshore processing centre. And they were sent there, being told by the Australian government that even if they had their refugee status approved, they would never be resettled in Australia. The second option, if you can call it an option, I guess maybe more a pathway, was involuntary return to their country of origin. And this was particularly reserved for people coming from Sri Lanka. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The third was indefinite detention. And when we talk about, oh yes, you know, in detention, people's mental health concerns increase. That's a pretty broad statement that moves us away from the actual experience. When people first arrive on Christmas Island, there's hope. People have used resource and skill to escape persecution, to escape state-inflicted violence, to make their way halfway around the world. We're talking about very able people. We're not talking about sick people. We're not talking about unwell people. But the time in detention, even if you have your food and your basic needs met, not being able to work, not being able to move freely, being a parent with an active young child and not being able to prepare food for them, to care for them in the way that you would like. This has huge effects. But the indefiniteness, being told, we don't know, can't tell you how long, not sure when you're going to have an interview. When people are unable to consider plans for the future, we see this rapid deterioration. Yeah? Am I going okay? I'm going okay. So I guess what I'm going off and coming back, and I hope that while I'm not keeping on one clear path, this is a very reflection of the work. It wasn't one clear path. But I really want to, I guess, describe the context in which people's experience was occurring. And as we've heard from our other speakers, that context, if we don't take into consideration context, our therapeutic practice is useless. It has no substance. Yeah? And to make this point clear, I recall a person that I was working with who decided to write a letter of resignation. And it went something like this: Dear mental health practitioners, thank you for all that you've tried to do for me. I have learnt many skills. I've learnt how to breathe. I've learnt relaxation techniques. I've learnt CBT. I can tell you about mindfulness. He said, but I'm very sorry. This hasn't helped. And I resign from being a patient. He said, I resign from being a patient because you offer me medication, but I was detained and I was force-fed medication as part of my torture. So I'm sorry, but I don't want to take medication. And he said, and I'm resigning because it's not that I need. I need social justice. So we're talking about a context where there's rapid political change that influences people's lives moment by moment, uncertainty, and this increasing mental health concerns. What does this deterioration do? It makes us start to disconnect from our identity. And when I talk about identity, I don't want this to sound individualistic, because identity can be even connecting to the cultural and family practices that we know and that we've been doing all our lives to keep ourselves strong and sustained. So when I heard people say, do I really exist? Does anyone know I'm here? Am I going crazy? this sense of not knowing self and losing all those connections, those relational connections, to be able to know oneself. That was one of the most difficult things to see in a detention centre, because at times there was about 2,500 people in detention. But there was no sense of connection, solidarity, because of the practices of detention itself, reflected by the government policies and practices. This culture of detention, this ethic of control, sought to divide people, and keeping people not connected to one another is the easiest way to control someone. So in our work, whilst I haven't talked about all the practices, and I won't have the time to talk about it today, I guess we need to consider what position and posture we're taking. And for me, this idea of ethic of control, I wanted to show in every interaction that I was aware of it, I was aware of that power, and that I was trying my best to resist it. And by resisting it, it was showing that I value an ethic of care. And I was in a powerful position. I was writing assessments, I was writing reports for people. So there were times when that is ethically in itself difficult. But if we're coming from a particular posture, if we meet with people and we openly talk about this, if we put it on the table and co-research it together, step away from this expert position and honour the expertise in people's life, then even if we don't heal the trauma, which is questionable because it's ongoing, it's still happening, it's not something in the past, it's still happening. But if we can do this, then we move from an idea of healing and fixing to enduring. And this is something that I want to make really clear today, is that what informed my practice was how do we connect to cultural and family practices that endure and sustain. It doesn't mean that next week the person will be improved. And it was the first work context that I was in where people deteriorated over the time that I worked with them, because there was something larger happening. There was an ongoing trauma occurring by being in detention. How many minutes? It's 20 minutes now. It's 20 minutes, so I've got like 5 minutes left. Whilst I have lots to say, would it be okay if I finish by sharing just a very small conversation I had with someone I worked with? Would that be okay? Thank you. So the air was heavy in the counselling room as Kumadavali and I sat together for the first time. I was holding the referral form in my hand from Detention Health, requesting an urgent intervention, as they were concerned for Kumadavali, as she had made a number of attempts on her life. As I sat there with the referral in my hand, I had that choice, whether I, whilst keeping safety at the centre of our work, whether I go down the ethic of control and take an expert position and tell her what she needs to do to be okay, or whether I respectfully decline that and instead seek to deconstruct and understand what's going on for her. I had a really strong sense of tiredness, of fatigue, and Kumadavali's expressions of the body were listless and minimal. I recall her saying to me that they, and by they she meant Detention Health, just didn't understand. She cannot go on like this. Why should they care if she is alive or not? I asked Kumadavali what it was that couldn't keep going on, and her reply was simple and direct, if not forceful. this inhumane treatment. Through my questions, I wished to show Kumadavali that I was prepared to co-research with her, what she was currently facing, rather than positioning myself in an authoritative or expert position. If we think about trauma and the ways that trauma occurs for people who are displaced by war and persecution, then we need to be aware of power in the room. And the ways that I use or don't use power can either replicate those very same traumatic experience, or it can offer a place for personal agency. Can I check with you that I'm understanding? You're sharing with me that you cannot go on with this inhumane treatment. Is it possible that you have endured inhumane treatment before this moment? And Kumadavali responded that for as long as she was alive, she had experienced inhumane treatment. Kumadavali, what are your thoughts about why, after enduring this treatment for such a long time throughout your life, that now, on Christmas Island, you have a sense of not being able to go on? Is there something new or different happening now that wasn't there before? Kumadavali shared with me that she had kept herself sustained during the boat journey to Christmas Island by telling herself that once she reached Australia, she would experience safety. And in fact, when she arrived on Christmas Island, she spoke about how the Navy had given her a life jacket and a bottle of water. She spoke about the significance of this act because she had expected, when she saw someone in uniform, that they were going to beat her. And they handed her water and a life jacket. She said that these gestures made her spirit rise, and when she first went to the detention centre and saw there was food provided for, that the staff did not beat her, she had a sense of safety. However, as the days turned into weeks, into months, and the involuntary returns to Sri Lanka began, she felt herself sinking again into a deeper despair. She also told me that she had never contemplated suicide or self-harm before in her life, and it filled her with fear, how easy and accessible it seemed. We spent time gently and slowly exploring and describing the themes of safety from those first moments, what she had experienced on Christmas Island. In this unpacking, she was able to also expand safety to include respect, human rights, and a sense of feeling like a worthwhile person deserving of safety. Now, with a more established island of safety and of identity and of what Kumadavali gives value to, we had a foundation from which to discern the expression and wish to die. Kumadavali told me that her experience of detention was stripping her of her skills, her choices, her ability to take action to keep herself safe. For her to know that people from Sri Lanka were being woken up in the early hours of the morning, given 10 minutes to pack their belongings, and then placed in a secured room before being transferred directly onto a plane bound for Colombo, reminded her of practices of terror that she had already experienced in Sri Lanka. The constant anxiety caused by the unknown and uncertainty felt unbearable, and Kumadavali told me that her life, her body, to some extent was the last aspect that she had some slight choice about, and her wish to die felt like the last action available to her to say no to the ongoing violations of her human rights. So by creating a multi-storied understanding of the wish to die through absent but implicit narrative practices, this supported Kumadavali to give meaning to her distress, to place it in the wider context of socio-political issues. In this process, what we noticed was the sense of urgency and desire to act upon her wish to die eased. I'm not saying for a moment that it was resolved, but by the slight space reclaimed, Kumudavali began to connect with her value for human rights and justice. This created a pathway in our work which included tracing and documenting her personal and family stories of resisting persecution alongside social and political histories of her country. Okay.
İçinde, umudun arayışı içinde olan, kendilerine yeni bir dünya yaratma çabası içinde olan insanların hikayesini paylaştı. Tabi aslında uzun uzun üzerinde konuşulacak konular bunlar. Ve özellikle bu narratif terapinin bu göçmenlerin, özellikle travma yaşayan, işkence yaşayan, sıkıntı yaşayan göçmenlerin bir anlamda travmalarının tedavisinde kullanılması, bu da oldukça önemli ve etkileyici. Belki biliyorsunuzdur, Poli ülkemizde de narratif terapinin eğitimlerini vermekte. Bu anlamda belki ondan daha çok istifade edeceğiz gelecek zaman içerisinde. Peki ben bir 10 dakika soru almak istiyorum hocamıza. Bu konuyla ilgili soru sormak isteyen varsa. Evet, burada bir soru.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask you one thing. How do you prevent it from being personal? How do you differentiate what's yours and what's theirs? I mean, do you sometimes lose your border, or how do you deal with it? And how should we deal with it? Thank you for everything.
Just a small question. Do we need that question translated first, or?
Kabul ettiği bazı durumlar, yani etkilendiği durumlar oluyor mu diye sordum kendisine ve nasıl bununla baş ediyor diye sordum.
Well, that's a big question, and we could spend many days unpacking it. If I could share one thing in response, just one. For me, understanding that I am not separate to the discourses that shape the people's lives that come to meet with me, and that I am not separate from my country's government's policies that impact and cause direct harm has been essential for me. When we realise that we are surrounded by the same discourses, it helps me to step into a role of co-research rather than trying to always position myself outside of it.
Evet, başka soru? Arkada bir el var.
Merhabalar. Sığınmacılarla çalışma yapmanın kuşkusuz en zor kısımlarından bir tanesi dil problemi. Özellikle terapistin göçmenin dilini bilmemesi, ki zaten her zaman ortak dili bulamıyorsunuz. Ülkenin çok farklı yerlerden göç alıyorsa. Bu gibi durumlarda aşırı derecede verbal, yani aşırı derecede sözel olan terapi tarzını seçmekle alakalı zorluklar yok mu? Ya da hangi terapi tarzını seçmek daha kolaylaştırıcı olabilir?
Thank you for the question. That was in part of my talk, I just didn't quite get there. All the sessions on Christmas Island are through interpreters that are sitting with us in the room, which is quite a privilege because often it's on the phone and it's quite different. What is interesting about Christmas Island is that we are not allowed the same interpreter twice. So if I meet with one person, I have one interpreter one week, a different interpreter the next week, and so forth. Which is why I brought up the story of saying goodbye at the beginning. Every time we met, we had to start again. Yeah? But what it did was it brought out these ideas and these practices around making each conversation and moment precious, but without this expectation of continuity, which ultimately leaves us with either a sense of failure or disconnect. So, yes, we use narrative therapy with interpreters, and what I also didn't get to in my talk is that at times interpreters were invited to witness people's stories because they share similarities in culture and language, similarities but difference. So sometimes it didn't go so well because of the power that was in the room, but other times it was another way of strengthening those alternative preferred stories of identity.
Son bir soru alalım.
Teşekkür ediyorum sunumum için. Ben bugünkü konuşmalardan şunu kendimce anladım. Gerçekten travmayla çalışmak ciddi bir uzmanlık alanı gerektiriyor. Hassas çizgileri var bu yüzden. Çünkü biz de çalışırken kendi travmamıza denk düşen yerler olabilir. Az önce beyefendinin belki sorduğu gibi. Bu durumlarda nasıl baş edeceğimiz zaten soruldu ve uzmanımız bunu da anlatmış oldu. Biz bir de şöyle bir anladım. Hani travmanın mahiyetinden ziyade şahsı nasıl etkilediği, hani o terapötik süreç içerisinde belki onun acısına ortak olmak gibi bir beden dilimi ya da nasıl tam kelimeyi de şu anda bulamadım ama ya acı çektiğini görüp kabul etmek bir nebze olsun daha iyi bir sonuç verir mi? Yani bazen çünkü yarayı kaşımak iyi bir sonuç da vermeyebiliyor. Bunların ayrımını ne zaman, nasıl yapmalıyız?
Thank you for your question. Again, shall we spend the next few days unpacking this? It's a really, really interesting question about not doing harm. Yeah, to be mindful in the way that we offer these practices. And I guess I might sound like I'm repeating myself, but coming back to that the very essence of narrative therapy is that we are always engaging in co-research. So we are always checking in. Before we even ask a question, before we even start, we might say something like, if we start to talk about something that doesn't feel okay, how might you tell me? So we do a lot of groundwork around really exploring what that process is going to look like. And for example, there was one gentleman who wanted to speak specifically about the details of torture. We spent many conversations talking about how we might go about that before we did it. Yeah? So I guess slowing it down, declining the invitation to be the expert, talking with people, and of course with interpretation and difference in language and culture, keep going until we have a sense of being on shared ground. Yeah. The narrative questions we might ask in our own language are they just become this jumbled mess when they're translated. So the practice becomes about how do we convey ideas and concepts in ways that can be shared. Yeah? Does that help?
Evet, okey. Şimdi siz söyleyince de zaten yine çağrışım yaptı. Gerçekten acının dili ortak aslında. Yani çok üzülen, çok yıprananı da orada görmüş oluyoruz. Ben teşekkür ediyorum.
I don't know whether the question is that the pain is the same, but that I, as a therapist, would never assume that I know what that pain is until we have explored it for the person or the family. Does that make sense?
Evet, bir sorumuz daha var. Can Hocam'dan alıp bitirelim artık. Evet hocam, buyurun.
Bir de özellikle Avustralya'daki bu denetim merkezleri ya da İngilizce tabiriyle detention center'larda kalan sığınmacılarda zaman zaman dudaklarını dikme şeklinde bir tepki oluyor. Acaba Tolga bu konuda nasıl bir yorum yapar? Çünkü bir sürede kaldığı için Christmas Island'da tahmin ediyorum belki bu konuda söyleyecekleri vardır, yorumları vardır. Okay, then I'll ask in English, and well, my question is very brief. What do you think about the lip sewing in detention centers?
Hocam biraz ağzınıza yaklaştırır mısınız?
Lip sewing. Yeah. Because quite often we see asylum seekers having, that kind of reaction, and unfortunately, the administrators misinterpret that and put it in different ways, such as protesting this and that. But obviously, it has some mental health implication, I assume. So I would like to have your views about that, because you have stayed Christmas Island for some time.
When you ask that question about lip sewing, the first thing that comes to my mind is, what do we see on the media about what happens in detention centres? And it's been a real success of those in power, of those who have the privilege to circulate information and knowledge, to demonise protest. And I guess to ask yourself the question, if you were in that situation, would you accept or would you make a stand? That aside, I have worked with a number of people who were involved in protests on Christmas Island, including lip sewing. Again, from a narrative perspective, we would try to start unpacking what that protest is about, what the history of that protest is about, to find alternative ways and understandings, not that we're saying it's right or wrong, but to find a multi-storied understanding of protest. A bit like the example of the wish to die. When we got to a sense of what that was about, there were other possibilities opened. And I guess in any practice that we're doing, we're wanting to not leave people in that narrowed position. But if after a conversation they have a sense that there's other possibility, then from our perspective that is helpful. That does respond. I don't know if that responds to your question.